11 years ago, she disappeared on him without a word. Then their companies merged.
I want to tell you first about the email. It came on a Tuesday at 8:52 in the morning from our CEO. Subject line, exciting news, which is corporate for brace yourself. I read it standing at the coffee machine with my badge still in my hand, and by the third paragraph, I had stopped breathing in any way that could be described as normal. Hendry Logistics, the company I had worked at for 6 years, the company where I ran operational strategy, the company that I had, over those 6 years, quietly and without telling anyone, built into something I was genuinely proud of, was merging with a company called Callaway Freight Systems. I knew Callaway Freight Systems. Everyone in the industry knew Callaway Freight Systems. It was bigger than us, better funded, and run by people I'd met at conferences and found, without exception, perfectly pleasant and slightly terrifying. What I did not expect, what nobody could have warned me about, because nobody else in the building had any reason to know, was the third paragraph from the bottom, where the email named the 2 people who would co-lead the integration task force, one from each company, given their deep operational expertise and proven ability to drive change. From Hendry, me, Maya Okafor. From Callaway, David Reyes. I read that name 4 times. Then I put my coffee down very carefully because my hand had started doing something I didn't trust it to keep doing while holding a hot liquid. And I walked into the nearest empty conference room and sat down and put my head against the cool glass wall and thought, with a clarity I rarely achieve before 9 in the morning, oh no. Here is what you need to know about David Reyes, and I'm going to tell it to you the way I would tell a friend, which is to say, badly and out of order, and with more honesty than is strictly flattering to me. David and I met in college, sophomore year, an economics seminar, assigned partners for a project neither of us wanted. We were supposed to dislike each other. That's how these things are supposed to go, in the version where it's a story. But we didn't. We liked each other immediately, and then we liked each other more, and by the end of the semester, we were the kind of 2 people who everyone else already considered a couple, before either of us had said anything about it out loud. We were together for 2 years. Good years, the kind you don't fully appreciate until much later, when you're trying to explain to someone why a person you haven't spoken to in over a decade still has the specific gravitational pull they have. And then, 3 months before graduation, I left. Not we broke up, not things ended. I mean, I left. I had been offered a position at Hendry that started immediately, before graduation even. An opportunity that does not come twice, and I took it. And I moved 400 miles away in 11 days. And in the chaos of finals and packing and the logistics of starting a real job at 21, I did not have the conversation I should have had. I sent one text. It said, and I am quoting this from memory because I have never been able to forget the exact wording. Things are moving fast with the job. I'll call you this weekend. Sorry for radio silence. I did not call that weekend. I did not call the weekend after. By the 3rd weekend, the not calling had become its own kind of decision. The longer I waited, the more there was to explain, and the more there was to explain, the more impossible it felt to start. Until eventually, I had constructed, through pure cowardice, a situation where the only options were an enormous, overdue conversation or no conversation at all. I chose no conversation at all. For 11 years. I am not going to pretend this is a complicated moral situation. It isn't. I ghosted someone I loved because I was 21 and scared, and the easy thing was to let a relationship end through silence rather than through a conversation that would have required me to say, out loud, I am choosing this job over us, which was true and which I could not bring myself to say. David didn't deserve that. I knew it at the time. I think that's actually the worst part. that I knew, even at 21, that what I was doing was a small act of cowardice dressed up as being busy. And I knew it more every year as I got older and understood better what it costs someone to be left like that. Not broken up with, not fought with, just left, with a text that promised a call that never came. I heard once, 3 years later, through a mutual friend, that he'd moved to Chicago and was doing well. I was glad. I was also, if I'm honest, relieved, because doing well in Chicago was vague enough that I could file it away and stop thinking about it, which I did, mostly successfully, for 8 more years. Until 8:52 on a Tuesday morning, when an email told me that David Reyes was now a senior director at Callaway Freight Systems, and that for the next 90 days, he and I were going to co-lead a task force in daily meetings with our names on the same slides in front of 2 entire companies. The first meeting was in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Callaway building, neutral ground. 12 people from both companies around a long table, and I had spent the entire elevator ride up rehearsing what I would say when I saw him. Something professional, something brief, something that acknowledged just enough history that it wouldn't be strange, and not so much that it would be a conversation. I had about 4 seconds when the door opened and he walked in to deploy any of it. He looked older, obviously, 11 years older. But in the specific way, some people get better looking as they get older, instead of just older, which I noted and immediately filed under information I did not need. He was wearing a gray suit. He had a folder under his arm. He scanned the room the way you do when you're looking for the person you already know is going to be there. And his eyes found mine, and something happened in his face. Fast, almost too fast to read. Gone before anyone else would have noticed it. And then it was gone, replaced by an expression of perfectly calibrated professional neutrality. And he said, "Maya, good to see you." "David," I said. "Likewise." That was it. That was the entire acknowledgement of 11 years. 4 words each. We sat down across the table from each other, 12 other people between us in a loose oval, and the meeting began. And for the next 90 minutes, we were Maya Okafor and David Reyes, co-leads of the Hendry Callaway Integration Task Force, and neither of us looked at the other any more than the meeting required. And both of us, I would bet a great deal of money, were thinking about absolutely nothing else. The task force met daily. Within a week, I understood why we'd been chosen, and it had nothing to do with our history. It was because David Reyes was, infuriatingly, exactly as good at his job as I was at mine, and the integration of 2 logistics companies of this size required 2 people who understood operations at the level we both did. And there were, apparently, not many people in either company who fit that description. He ran Callaway's distribution network. I ran Hendry's. Our systems were different, our cultures were different, and our job, the actual task force job underneath the corporate language, was to figure out how to merge 2 operational philosophies that had each spent years optimizing for being right about different things. The first 3 weeks were, professionally, some of the hardest of my career, and not because of David. Because the work itself was enormous. Warehouse networks that didn't overlap the way the executives assumed they did, route systems built on completely different software, 2 workforces that were about to find out they were being merged and were, understandably, anxious about it. David and I disagreed constantly. Not personally, operationally. He thought Hendry's regional hub model was inefficient. I thought Callaway's centralized model didn't account for the kind of last-mile complexity Hendry had spent years solving for. We argued about this in front of 12 people, 3 times a week, for 3 weeks, with the specific intensity of 2 people who respect each other's competence enough to actually fight about it, rather than just disagree politely and move on. "You're optimizing for an average that doesn't exist," he said in week 2 about the regional hub model in front of the entire task force. "And you're optimizing for a best case that only shows up 40% of the time," I said. "Show me the other 60. I showed him the other 60. It took most of an afternoon. By the end of it, he didn't agree with me, not entirely, but he'd moved, and the model we eventually proposed was neither his nor mine and was better than either. I went home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, because I had just spent 6 hours in a room with David Reyes fighting about hub models, and at some point during that afternoon, I had laughed, actually laughed at something he'd said, a dry comment about a competitor's failed attempt at the exact thing we were arguing about, and he had looked at me when I laughed, and for half a second, it had been 11 years ago, in a study room, arguing about something that mattered much less than logistics hubs and meaning much more. I sat in my car and thought, this is going to be a problem. It became more of a problem in week 4, when the task force traveled together to inspect one of the overlapping distribution hubs in Ohio. 6 of us, 2 days, 1 hotel. The kind of trip that exists specifically to remind everyone involved that they are, underneath the org chart, just people who have to eat dinner somewhere. The site visit itself was fine. Long, technical, useful. We walked the warehouse floor for 4 hours, and David asked questions about Hendry's hub operations that were sharper than anything in the official documentation, and I found myself, more than once, explaining something to him with more detail than the question strictly required, because I wanted him to see it the way I saw it. I noticed myself doing this. I filed it away with the rest of the things I was filing away. Dinner was the 6 of us at a steak place near the hotel. Long table, work conversation drifting slowly into not work conversation, the way it does after the second round of drinks. Somewhere around dessert, one of the Callaway analysts, a sharp, slightly mischievous woman named Priya, who I would come to like a great deal over the following weeks, asked, apparently innocently, how David and I had first met, since, apparently, you two argue like you've known each other forever. There was a pause. Not a long one, but a pause. "We went to school together," David said, easily, reaching for his water glass. "A long time ago." "Small world," Priya said, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations do, and nobody at that table thought anything else about it. And I sat there thinking, he didn't say economics seminar. He didn't say 2 years. He said school together, which is true, and which is also the smallest possible true thing he could have said. I thought about that on the walk back to the hotel. The 6 of us split off in pairs and groups the way people do after a long dinner, and David and I ended up, not by any visible arrangement, walking the last block together, a little behind the others. "Thank you," I said, "for the small world version." He glanced at me. "It's true, though. We did go to school together, a long time ago." "I know it's true. I'm thanking you for choosing it." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure what version you wanted," he said, "so I picked the one that was true and also didn't require either of us to have a longer conversation in front of Priya about something neither of us has figured out how to talk about with each other yet, let alone with an audience." That's very diplomatic. I work in operations, Maya. Diplomacy is most of the job. We reached the hotel. The lobby was bright and a little too loud, and the others were ahead of us, already at the elevators, and for a second, just a second, it was the 2 of us, alone, in the relative quiet of the entrance, and I had the strangest feeling that something was about to happen. The kind of feeling you get half a step before you either trip or catch yourself. "Good night, Maya," he said. "Good night, David." Nothing happened. We went to our separate rooms on separate floors, and the next morning we were back in meeting voice, and the Ohio trip became, on the surface, a successful site visit and nothing else. But I lay awake for a while that night thinking about the word yet. something neither of us has figured out how to talk about with each other yet. And the fact that he'd said it so easily, like it was simply a true description of where things stood, an open door he hadn't walked through and also hadn't closed. It became, over the following weeks, a manageable problem. That's the honest way to describe it. I developed what I privately called the meeting voice, a register, professional, warm but not too warm, that I could maintain for the length of any task force interaction, and which allowed me to be in a room with David Reyes for hours at a time without either of us referring, even obliquely, to the fact that we had a shared past that neither of us had mentioned. He developed something similar, I think, although I couldn't see it from the inside the way I could see my own. What I could see was that he was good at this, easily, naturally good, in the way he'd always been good at navigating a room, and that the David Reyes running Callaway's distribution network was, in most observable ways, the same person I'd known at 20, except more so. More sure of himself, funnier, in the specific dry way he'd always been funny, but with more confidence behind it. Better, somehow, at being exactly as kind as a situation required, and not 1 degree more, which I recognized because it was a skill I'd had to learn too, for entirely different reasons. We were, I noticed, very similar people. We had been very similar people at 20, which was probably why it had worked. And we were very similar people now, which was probably why the meeting voice was necessary. The thing that broke the meeting voice happened in week 7, and it had nothing to do with either of us, directly. It happened because of a server. The task force had identified early on that the two companies' route optimization systems needed to be unified before the operational merger could proceed. You can't run one logistics network on 2 incompatible software platforms. Not at our scale, not without chaos. The migration was scheduled for a weekend in late spring. Cut over Friday night, validate Saturday, be ready for Monday's full operational load. It went wrong at 11:40 on Friday night. Not catastrophically wrong at first, a data mapping error, the kind of thing that happens in migrations of this size, that the migration team flagged immediately and started working on. But the error compounded. By 1 a.m., it had cascaded into something that, if not fixed before Monday, would mean 2 merged companies' worth of freight had no functioning routing system on the single busiest operational day of the month. I got the call at 1:15 a.m. I was at the office by 1:50. David was already there. He'd gotten the call too. Of course he had. He was the other co-lead. And he was standing in the middle of the operations floor, in jeans and a Callaway hoodie, looking at 3 screens at once. And when I walked in, he looked up and said, without any preamble, without any of the meeting voice at all, "Okay, good. I need someone who actually understands the Hendry routing logic, and everyone who built it is asleep in a different time zone." "I built most of it," I said. "I know," he said. "That's why I called you before I called anyone else." We worked through the night. I want to describe this carefully because it's the part of the story that matters, and it's not romantic in the way the word usually means. Nobody held anybody's hand over a printout of routing algorithms. What happened was something else. Something I think might actually be rarer. For about 9 hours, 2 people who had spent 11 years not talking to each other, and then 7 weeks talking to each other very carefully, simply worked together at the absolute top of what they were each capable of, with no register at all, no meeting voice, no professional neutrality, just 2 minds that fit together the way they always had, doing the thing they were both best in the world at, because the situation required nothing less, and there was no time to perform anything. He'd call out a routing conflict, and I'd already be 3 steps into the fix before he finished the sentence. I'd flag a data inconsistency, and he'd say, "Yeah, that's a Tuesday batch, I see it," before I'd even pointed to the screen. At 4 a.m., we were both on the floor, literally on the floor, surrounded by printouts because the migration team's monitor wasn't big enough, tracing a routing error through 6 systems by hand because the automated tools couldn't see what we could see. At one point, 4:30, maybe 5, I found the root cause, a mapping table that had been built for Hendry's old regional hub structure, the one David had spent week 2 arguing was inefficient, and which we'd kept in modified form in the new unified model. The migration had applied Callaway's mapping logic on top of it without accounting for the modification. I sat back. "It's the hub model," I said. "The thing you said was inefficient." He looked at it, looked at me. "I was right that it was inefficient," he said. "I was wrong that we should have gotten rid of it. It's inefficient, and it's also the only thing that makes the last mile numbers work, which is the thing you spent an entire afternoon proving to me in week 2. "I remember. I know you remember." He was quiet for a second. "You remember everything, Maya. You always did." It was 5 a.m. We were sitting on the floor of an operations center surrounded by printouts, both of us running on coffee and adrenaline. And he said it quietly, not as part of the fix, not as part of anything. Just a true thing, said out loud. The first true thing either of us had said to the other in 11 years that wasn't about freight. I didn't say anything for a moment. "Yeah," I said finally. "I do. We fixed it." By 7 a.m., the system was validating clean. By 8, the migration team confirmed it was ready for Monday. By 8:30, the rest of the task force started arriving for the regular morning stand-up and walked into an operations floor that looked like a disaster scene. Printouts everywhere, both co-leads on the floor in last night's clothes, and David and I looked at each other, and something passed between us that I think, for the first time in 7 weeks, neither of us managed to put back into the meeting voice in time. Someone, one of the junior analysts, said, "Oh my God, did you two sleep here?" "We fixed the hub model," David said, standing up, offering me a hand to get up off the floor, which I took, which felt like the most ordinary thing in the world and also like something neither of us had done in 11 years. "Tell everyone the Monday load is fine. We're going to go get actual coffee." We went to get actual coffee, a diner 2 blocks from the office, the kind of place that's open at 8 a.m. on a Saturday for exactly this reason. And we sat in a booth by the window, both of us still in last night's clothes. And for a long time, neither of us said anything. And it wasn't the silence of the meeting voice. It was a different kind of silence. The kind where you both know something is about to be said, and you're letting it arrive at its own pace, because there's no version of rushing it that would be better. "I'm going to say something," David said finally, "and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond, because I've been not saying it for 7 weeks, and I think if you interrupt me, I'll lose my nerve." "Okay. For 11 years, he said, I told myself a story about what happened. The story was, you got a better opportunity, you took it, and somewhere in the chaos of that, what we had just stopped mattering enough to you to require a conversation. I told myself that story because it was easier than the alternative, which was that it mattered and you still didn't have the conversation, which seemed worse somehow, even though I know now that's backwards. The first story makes you someone who didn't care. The second makes you someone who cared and was a coward about it. And for 11 years, I told myself the first one, because at 23, she didn't care was easier to carry around than she cared and left anyway. He stopped, took a breath. "And then I spent 7 weeks in meetings with you," he said, "watching you care about everything. About the work, about the people on both teams, about getting it right, even when getting it right meant admitting you were wrong about the hub model, which, for the record, you weren't, not entirely. Last night proved that. And I kept thinking, this is not a person who didn't care. This was never a person who didn't care. So what actually happened?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I was 21, I said. And I'd just been offered the only job I'd ever wanted, and it started in 11 days. And I knew, David, even then, that if I called you and we had the actual conversation, the real one, about what it meant that I was leaving and what that meant for us, I was either going to talk myself out of taking the job, or I was going to take it and break both our hearts on a phone call, while also trying to pack my entire life into 11 days. And I couldn't. I didn't have it in me to do either of those things. So I did the third thing, which was nothing, which was worse than both of the others, and I knew that too, even at the time. And I did it anyway, because it let me not feel it for a little while longer. And then a little while longer became 3 weeks. And 3 weeks became a story I told myself about how it would be even harder to call after 3 weeks than it would have been after 3 days. And then 3 weeks became 3 years. And at some point, it just became the thing that had happened. The way things become the thing that happened if you don't do anything about them for long enough. He was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," he said eventually, because it wasn't. For a long time. I want to say this honestly, because I think honesty is the only thing that's actually useful right now. You were the worst thing that happened to me for about 2 years. Not because of who you were, but because of how it ended, or didn't end. The not knowing was the part that was hard. Harder than if you just told me you didn't want this anymore. At least that's a thing you can be angry at. Silence isn't a thing. You can't be angry at silence. You can only just sit in it. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I've been sorry for a long time, David. I didn't have anyone to say it to, because saying it required finding you, and finding you required admitting what I'd done. And I think some part of me decided it was kinder to you to just stay gone, which I now understand is not how that works." But that's where I landed at 23 and then 25, and at some point it was just the shape of things. "I know. I really am sorry." "I know that too," he said. "I think I've known it since week 2, honestly." "The hub model argument," he almost smiled. "You fought for 6 hours to prove a point because you genuinely believed it mattered to get it right, even though it would have been easier to just let it go. That's the same person. That's exactly the same person I knew at 20. I think some part of me has been recalibrating for 7 weeks, trying to figure out how the person who fights that hard to get something right is the same person who disappeared on me without a word. And last night, I think I finally got it. It's not a contradiction. It's the same thing pointed in different directions. You cared too much to have the conversation, so you didn't have it. And you cared too much about the hub model to let it go, so you didn't let it go. It's the same intensity. It just went somewhere different 11 years ago, and it went somewhere terrible. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief exactly, something more specific than relief. The feeling of being seen, actually seen, the whole shape of a thing, including the parts that didn't reflect well on you, and not flinched away from. "So where does that leave us?" I said, "operationally speaking." He laughed, really laughed, the first real laugh of the morning, breaking something in the air between us that needed breaking. "Operationally speaking," he said, "I think we have 83 days left on this task force, and I think we're about to do the best work of both our careers, because last night proved we're better at this together than either of us is apart. And I don't want to spend 83 days in the meeting voice anymore. I'm tired of the meeting voice. I've been tired of it for 7 weeks. Me too. And non-operationally speaking," he stopped, looked at me. There was something in his face that I recognized, suddenly, completely. It was the exact look from the economics seminar, 11 years and a lifetime ago. The look of someone working up to say something he'd already decided to say and was just finding the door for. "Non-operationally speaking," he said, "I think I'd like to take you to dinner. Not the diner, an actual dinner. And I think I'd like it to be soon, because I've apparently been ready to ask you that for about 7 weeks, and I'd rather not spend 11 more years getting around to it." I looked at him. David Reyes, 11 years older, in a Callaway hoodie, in a diner booth, having just spent the night on the floor of an operations center fixing a routing system we'd built half of together without either of us saying so. And I thought about the 11 years, and the text I never followed up on, and the meeting voice, and the hub model, and all of it, all the silence, finally being on the other side of something instead of inside it. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." The dinner happened 9 days later. Both of us were buried in task force work, and there's something almost funny about two people who just had the most important conversation of the last decade immediately going back to spreadsheets. But that's what happened, because the work was real and it didn't stop for us. He picked a small Italian place a few blocks from neither of our offices. Neutral ground again, except this time neither of us needed it to be neutral. We just both liked the idea of somewhere new, somewhere that wasn't a conference room or a diner or an operations floor at 5 a.m. I got there first. I'd changed my outfit twice, which I want on the record because it felt important to admit that even after everything, after the all-nighter, after the diner, after 11 years, I still cared. In the specific nervous way you care before a first date, what David Reyes thought when he walked in and saw me. He walked in 4 minutes late, which for David was practically early, and he was wearing a shirt I didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought something new, which meant he'd had the same conversation with himself in front of his closet that I'd had in front of mine. And somehow that small, mutual, slightly embarrassing fact made everything easier. "Hi," he said. "Hi. This is strange," he said, sitting down. "Good strange, but strange." I know. I keep almost saying something about the Q3 distribution numbers and then remembering that's not why we're here. You can say it if you want. I really don't want to. We ordered, we talked, actually talked for 3 hours about everything we hadn't talked about in the meeting voice for 7 weeks and hadn't talked about at all for 11 years. His move to Chicago, my 6 years at Hendry, the parts of it I'd never told anyone because there'd been no one who'd known the person I was before it. The apartment he'd lived in for 4 years that he still thought of sometimes as the one with the bad radiator, the same way I still thought of a dorm room neither of us had set foot in for over a decade. At one point, he reached across the table, not dramatically, just reached, the way you do for the bread, except it wasn't the bread, it was my hand, resting on the table near my water glass. And he didn't say anything about it, and I didn't say anything about it, and we just kept talking, his hand over mine, for the rest of dinner, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Which, I suppose, by then, it was. The task force finished its 90 days 2 weeks early, which I'm told has never happened on an integration project of this size, and which the executives attributed, in the closing presentation, to exceptional alignment between the co-leads. They were not wrong, although they did not know, and still don't, as far as I'm aware, exactly how exceptional, or how recently arrived at that alignment was. David and I have been together for 1.5 years now. We don't work on the same team anymore. There were, it turned out, some perfectly sensible policies about that, which neither of us argued with, and which we'd both have proposed ourselves if no one else had gotten there first. But we still, occasionally, get pulled into the same room for something operational. And when we do, there's a moment, every time, where I catch him looking at me across a conference table, the way he looked at me that first day, the 4-second flash before the meeting voice came down. Except now, neither of us puts the meeting voice back up. We just look at each other, for a second, in front of whoever happens to be in the room, and then we get back to work. Last month, he found in a box of things from his old apartment a printout from that economics seminar, the actual project, the one we were assigned as partners, 23 years old and stapled in the corner, both our names on the cover page. He didn't say anything about it. He just put it on my desk one morning, no note, and went to his meeting. I kept it. It's in the drawer of my desk now, under everything else, and every so often, not often, just sometimes, on a hard day or a good one, I take it out and look at the 2 names on the cover page, the same 2 names that are on the slides of an integration task force 11 years later, and I think about how long it took and how unnecessary all of that time was, and how glad I am, in the end, that the universe apparently does not care how badly you handle something the first time. It just waits. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're very, very lucky, it gives you a server failure at 11:40 on a Friday night, and a hub model, and a diner 2 blocks from the office, and another chance to do it right. Which, I've learned, is sometimes all a second chance actually is. Not a clean slate, just another room with the same person in it, and this time, you say the thing.